Hello and welcome to our panel event, Looking Forward, Looking Back, a conversation on race and sexual violence. My name's Jay Breslaw and I'm CEO of Survivors Network, and we're here to mark 30 years of service provision in Sussex for survivors of sexual violence and to look forward to the next 30 years. I'm going to hold the space today and open the discussion. However, the questions have been agreed collaboratively and the discussion will be led by the panellists. Please join me in listening to the expert perspectives of Marai Larasai, Shalini Nair, Shamanta Roy as they discuss feminism, survivor service provision, and the importance of women of colour being included at every level of the conversation. This is a huge discussion to cover in an hour, so please join us in seeing this as the start of many potentially challenging conversations for us to continue in our own spaces and not as an exhaustive expression of the needs of women of colour in survivor support work. So to start, I'm going to introduce each speaker in turn and ask them, why do you feel this topic is important to discuss in this sector? So first to Shalini. Shalini is a trustee with Survivors Network and a gender studies PhD scholar at the University of Sussex, whose research is on sexual violence in India. Her pronouns are she, her. She has been a journalist in India for over 15 years, reporting on the social sector policies of the Indian government, as well as its implementation on ground. Her work on gender, social justice and development has received many prestigious national and international awards, including the Thomson Reuters Kirk Short Awards in International Journalism in 2018. So over to you, Shalini. Why do you feel this topic is important to discuss in this sector?
Thank you, Jay. I feel that we have to discuss this topic as part of an ever-evolving conversation because we need to understand rape as not an exceptional act, but as a continuum of oppression sustained by certain power structures. Unless we challenge these structures, we cannot end sexual violence. Unfortunately, the mainstream understanding of sexual violence locates all its problems in the few bad men. The perfect embodiment of this flawed notion is a statue of Medusa that was recently installed outside the Manhattan courthouse where Harvey Weinstein was convicted. Now, in the original Greek myth, Medusa was beheaded by Perseus after she was raped by Poseidon. This statue of Medusa holding the dismembered head of Perseus is ostensibly a subversive act. The statue is seen by most people as a tribute to the Me Too movement. However, it is everything that our response to sexual violence should not be. One, it's not about the bad men, but about the structures that sustain violence, structures of patriarchy, race, caste, class, gender barriers, gender binaries. Two, instead of celebrating the masculine revenge fantasy of taking over power, our feminist response to sexual violence is about dismantling the power structures. And three, and the last point, this is something that Me Too founder Tarana Burke has also pointed out. Our idea of justice is not retribution. Our idea of justice is restorative and transformative justice. And it is in order to shatter these very myths that we need to discuss topics like these constantly.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Shalini. And now to Shamanta. Shamanta Roy is currently head of research at IMCAN, a national membership organisation for the by and for ending VAUG sector. She has experience of conducting strength-based policy influencing research and evaluation on violence against Black minoritized women and girls. She recently co-authored an in-depth piece of research on sexual violence, Reclaiming Voice, with Dr. Ravi Tiara, which looked at the interpersonal and structural barriers that survivors were subject, the types of support women and girls value, and sector responses. She is very passionate about reframing the problematic racialized ways in which research is often carried out. So over to you, Shamanta. Why do you feel this topic is important to discuss in this sector?
I think there's some overlaps with what Shalini has said, and no doubt Mara I will always also say. So I think we need to stop looking at solutions through the focus of individuals. We do need to look at structures. Because racism, racialized violence as a form of violence against women and girls has been an issue that's been erased, it's been marginalized for far too long, whether it's by the state, the mainstream sector. You can't actually address any form of violence really as a society without looking at the inequalities that drive it, that create gender-based violence in the first place. When we started our research at IMCAN, that was back in 2015, we wanted to look at sexual violence. It was actually really about making the voices, the perspectives, the needs of women of colour visible, where they had been quite invisible. And so in a UK context, particularly where there was, we were having another national crisis, a public debate around failures to addressing institutional child sexual abuse. There was yet another government review about what isn't working within the criminal justice system. People were talking about a surge in reporting, police reporting, post-Savile. Of course, really important, necessary discussions. But from our perspective, what we didn't see was what was really happening to women of colour. Were they speaking to anyone? If they were, who were they speaking to? Where were they going? If they were going, were they getting an appropriate service response? What we see time and time again is a sort of invisibility around particular women's perspectives with what gets presented within, whether you're talking about statistics, whether you're talking about public policy, whether you're talking about media coverage. Also, just, I don't know about the others, I'm sure they'll agree, but I'm a bit over being portrayed as a language barrier or a citizenship status or a hard to reach person, and that's usually how we are presented, if we ever are, whether it's in media or even if it's in policy.
Oh, lovely. Thank you for that, Shamanta. And now to Marai. Marai is a Black, African, Caribbean, British feminist advocate, community organizer and consultant who has worked in social justice for over 25 years with a specific focus on ending violence against Black, global majority women and girls. She's a former executive director of IMCAN. Her work has included and been framed by collaborations with other Black, global majority and Indigenous feminist activists and practitioners in diverse contexts. She currently works across a range of spheres and sectors, providing strategic, policy, practice, and training support, centers on areas such as decoloniality, intersectionality, racial justice, and ending violence against women and girls. So over to you, Marai. Why do you feel this topic is important to discuss in this sector?
Thank you, Jay, and thank you to Survivors Network for opening the space for this conversation. These are conversations that we have between us very often as global majority women, as women of colour, as Black women. I think part of why this conversation is important is because actually we need white folk to talk about race, right? And like there is a way that if you have a bit more melanin, that you're the people that are raced. Like actually, white people became raced during the colonial project, right? And so for me, the question would always be like, why would we not talk about race? And why is there such a silence in or sexual violence work more broadly around issues relating to race and racialization, issues relating to race and racism? As my sisters have already pointed out, there is something around which narratives we choose to center. There is something around the individualization of sexual violence. And of course, as violence is embodied, as it's lived and so forth, it is experienced very much on an individual level. But there is something about the need to connect individual experience, individual subjugation to the broader structural and systemic frameworks, right? And race and white supremacy, for example, are critical parts of what I like to call the white supremacist heteropatriarchy that is also ableist and casteist and so forth, right? And if we don't have those conversations, if we don't critique, if we don't attend to those structures, then essentially what we're doing is we're holding on to a homogenous narrative around who happens to be a victim survivor and who happens to be a perpetrator. That's one thing. There's also something for me, which is, and Shamantha and I, you know, at IMCAN, this was like literally or professional lived experience, which is anything done to a Black body, anything done to the body of a woman of color, either disappearing from the narratives more broadly or being framed always within this kind of cultural reference point, right? So when it happens, like, and it so ties into what Shalini said, like the idea of the individual, dangerous, monstrous perpetrator is for me like really problematic on so many levels, but it's usually white men that get to be the individual monstrous perpetrator, right? Because Black men of color actually are acting according to cultural norms in terms of how the narratives around how violence is perpetrated is developed. And so some of why we need to talk about race is we need to think about where do we need to be attending to in terms of our activism or policy work or resistance. Who needs to be involved in that? What kind of truth telling is required? What should solidarity look like? And why do white women leave us all the time as Black women, as women of color, to have the conversations about race, to bring the conversations about race? We live in these bodies and we are harmed in these bodies and we are subjected to violence in these bodies and we resist from the place of our bodies. And we are constantly bringing our allyship and solidarity to a broader project, a broader dismantling of structural inequality feminist project. And what we don't have in return from our white sisters often enough is intentional focus on dismantling, you know, gender inequality as it intersects with issues such as race and class and caste and disability and so forth. And so for me, this conversation is necessary. We have to have it at the center of our feminist project. If we're not doing that, then our feminism isn't intersectional, which means for me, it's not the kind of feminism that I'm willing to engage with.
Wow, thank you so much. I am so excited around this discussion. I was excited anyway, but thank you so much to all the panelists for joining us, and I'll get on with the first question. So first question, and just a reminder, these have been agreed like collaboratively by the panelists, because us at Survivors Network, we didn't want this to be about what we thought the discussion needed to be. So the first question is, what do you believe an effective movement against violence against women looks like, particularly in terms of supporting Black and minoritized survivors? And where do you see rape crisis work within that? So over to the panelists, who would like to lead on answering this question?
So taking off from what Mariah just said, you know, for a very long time, the mainstream feminist discourse has erred in taking the white cis woman as a stand-in for the universal womanhood. And now I think we do fall in a similar trap of using the nomenclature BME to erase the differences within BME women. To begin with, racially, some are more marginalized than others. And this is something that we have to constantly acknowledge. And also, race intersects with class, with disability, with gender identity, with age, and in the South Asian context, with class, with caste, to create further marginalities. And all these compound their experience of sexual violence and also limit access to justice. I guess once we are clear on this, only then can our rape crisis work truly support BME survivors without reinforcing the structural barriers that they face outside. And I think the reason that many rape crisis centers report few BME survivors reaching out to them is their failure on this front. The much higher rates reported by the BME-led services also points to why representation is important. And representation is not just about ticking the boxes in terms of racial diversity, but also having BME persons with disabilities, with varying gender identities, and ensuring a conducive environment for them to work. And we do need dedicated BME services, of course we do, but we also need everyone involved in rape crisis work, irrespective of their race, to have an intersectional understanding of oppression, and which only comes through constant education. And I have often seen that in the UK especially, and an overemphasis in official policies on issues related to, say, female genital mutilation, honor killings, or forced marriages, all these often ends up pathologizing certain communities. And what we need is instead an approach that recognizes the unique position of BME survivors, who often face this dilemma of speaking out against their community, a community which is already much discriminated against. And we have to respect their need for support without reproducing the institutional racism and the cultural stereotypes that often prevent them from speaking up time and again. And one another very important thing, I feel that, and this is something I passionately believe in, like rape crisis work cannot happen in silos without confronting the state. And by state, I mean its many policies, for example, something like austerity measures, which always disproportionately affect BME survivors, be it in terms of right to housing or access to reproductive, sexual or mental health services. And also in case of survivors with, say, insecure immigration status or those seeking asylum, their exclusion from welfare benefits often marginalizes them further and preventing them from speaking up. I think we need to acknowledge that carceral laws, including immigration laws, have a gendered impact. And before we can eliminate sexual violence, we have to ensure that all these systems have to be abolished.
Thank you.
I'm happy to go next.
Great.
Because it follows on quite well, actually. We need the rape crisis movement, as Shalini has said, to address and understand the systematic structures of violence that are there, telling us or telling survivors that they're there to protect, to provide justice, to provide safety, but what they're actually doing is creating harm, secondary trauma, whether it's within austerity, mental health, forensic interventions, and all of the areas that sort of disproportionately impact on Black and minoritized communities in really problematic ways. When we listen to, in the UK, the lobbying focus has been around the criminal justice system. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So when we actually start talking to survivors about justice, they tend to look at it through a much wider lens. And as Marai was saying earlier, we've been talking about this for a long time. When they were looking at criminalizing forced marriage, we were not supportive of that at all. We were supportive of an approach that was more restorative, transformative, different. When you talk to women, they will talk about what does justice look like for them? They'll talk about prevention, protecting their families, their children, safeguarding future generations from violence. They'll talk about being believed, being accepted by families, peers, society, being supported by the sort of specialist providers. They'll talk about not being pressured by the police officer or by the prosecutors to take a criminal justice route when they know that they'll sit in court and they're going to feel like they're on trial again. They might walk into the courtroom and the jury's already made a decision, particularly if they're from a Black and minoritized community. It's about not having professionals discriminate, make assumptions about their lives, having their trauma pathologized, including the type of violence they've experienced, as was said earlier, but culturally framed or medicalized, subject to forensic intervention. It's about having spaces of support where women feel held, understood, where they don't have to explain themselves. That's justice. It's about having support structures that are safe according to your, intersectional social identities and contexts. And if we start looking at support through that lens, we start looking at solutions that probably look quite different to what we have, which is often leaves survivors with few options.
I guess in many ways, I'm echoing exactly what has been said thus far. Just to kind of, I want to pick up on Shalini's point around that homogenization of global majority communities that are minoritized on these islands. And I love to point out that actually people of color are 80% of the world's population. Like, we really are not minority anything. We are global majority. We happen to be politically and socially minoritized on these islands, but there are more of us than there are of white people, you know? And so I'm gonna kind of hold that kind of space of how global majority people are homogenized within the BME framing, right, on these islands, and what that means in terms of who, you know, which communities, which women deprioritize within these racialized hierarchies that get created, what that means in terms of women who have a different set of intersecting needs from the ones that end up showing up in services, because services are very often designed to reach the people that are closest to the center. So actually, if we started to go, you know, as Bell Hooks said, if we went from margins to the center, then actually your framing might be really different and might feel uncomfortable and unsettling at first, but actually might be useful for all of us, right? So if we were to attend to the spaces of the most acute marginalization, what would that actually look like? What kind of conversations would we be having? Which violence would we name? Because there is such silence around violence more broadly. We don't talk enough about state-sanctioned violence. We don't talk about the state as an actor in terms of harming women and girls more broadly, but especially global majority girls. We don't talk about, you know, ways, for example, you know, across the world, systems of, say, forced sterilization, you know, that disabled women have to be subjected to. We don't talk about the violence of colonization. We don't talk about the way that partition rendered whole groups of people, you know, homeless, and the violence that was done to women and continue to be done to women in relation to that. We don't talk about the way the European colonial project resulted in trafficking and enslavement of millions of people, and how Black bodies then became inscribed in that, and the way that then shapes whether, for example, a woman of African heritage is deemed to be credible when she turns up at a police station, or even when she turns up to talk to some of her white sisters, when she says, this is what I've been subjected to. How often is she actually believed? How often is she seen as credible? How have those legacies actually shaped the way that we understand who does what to whom and how? And so for me, if I think about the kind of movement that we do need to end violence against women and girls, it has to be one that builds from the margins. It has to, the way that we have, and I know why we got here. You know, like as human beings, we center our needs, right? Like we center the things that like are closest to us. And so if we have this kind of Eurocentric homogenous idea of gender, then we're gonna center that because that's the thing that actually is there right in front of us. However, that's not doing all that we need to have done right now. There is also a way, and I'm just gonna probably be a little bit kind of especially challenging right now. There is a way somehow on these islands that we like to think we invented feminism. Like we like to think somehow that actually women in the geopolitical South are not resisting violence. We like to somehow believe that actually we were the people who started to name violence against women and girls. Actually, globally, women have been resisting in different ways. And some of what we could probably do on these islands is actually learn from some of the strategies and the ways that women located in the geopolitical South are actually resisting and organizing. Because some of the creativity, some of the innovation, some of them moving away or resisting the carceral frameworks actually rest in the movement building, the activism and the community organizing done by women in the geopolitical South. So for me, it demands that we actually think about what's the best of what we have right now and how do we leave some things along the wayside? How do we say we're brave enough to allow ourselves to evolve into a different kind of movement building space that then, for me, would result in a reshaping of our services, and it would result in resisting the state. Rape crisis services, along with the BME sector, have been the spaces that have provided the most resistance to the state in terms of ending violence against women and girls work. It was always the sexual violence services that were the difficult people in the room. And it was always the BME services that were the difficult people in the room. To what extent have we become implicated in the state agenda? And to what extent do we need to actually take ourselves back to being the resistors and the difficult ones? Because that might actually help us to position ourselves differently in terms of the state.
I invite the panelists to respond to anything that's been said or anything that they'd like to add.
No, just to add to Mariah's point about the state, I think that's something we often keep out of the conversation. The role of a state that's both carceral and neoliberal, and the kind of twin burdens it puts on BMA women with all its policies. And I don't think we can talk about any of these intersecting factors without bringing this role of the state in and without opposing these policies tooth and nail. So yeah, I agree with Mariah on that.
I just wanted to add something about the movement itself, and I think what there could be room for the movement itself to do more. And I talk about whether it's the rape crisis movement or the broader violence against women and girls movement in the UK, is that unless they start asking themselves internally about how racism and other types of oppression actually manifest within their organisations, whether it's within their own governance structures, their practice, the way they partner with other organisations, their type of advocacy that they do based on, what was said earlier. I don't think it's possible for them to be able to do this work in a really meaningful way. And I don't think there's been enough space for internal, honest dialogue with, practitioners from the Black and minoritized sector, the global majority, the women of colour movement, between the rape crisis movement and those women, and more generally. And I think unless you know how you are contributing to the problem, you can't start to look at, how you address solutions to it either, and that involves, recognizing, as was said earlier, that there's models of delivery and activism and resistance and ways of learning, which then are spaces for learning, but they end up being co-opted or duplicated. But we're not asking for duplication, because the duplication leads to something that will inevitably not be intersectional. And it's about creating space, sharing power, resources, really, really thinking about it.
Can I also add something? I think we need also a disruption of the benevolence and the saviorism, right? Because that's also a kind of a very painful dimension. There is a way sometimes that or broader ending violence against women and girls work on these islands can feel like a kind of mirroring of some of the international development framing. And so, we are not asking for rescuing or for benevolence or, it's not that. We're talking about power sharing, and we're talking about who gets to speak for who. And we're talking about, in a context where, Shamantha and I from kind of, if you like, the Imkan angle and Shalini reference this a little bit. If we talk about what has happened with services, if we talk about what's happened with buy and for services, we set up services because those services were needed. And what's been so difficult is the ways that rather than or sister organizations bringing solidarity, they have chosen to compete with us for very limited resources in ways that has, on some occasion meant the closure of vital services like lifeline services. So for me, what a sector could look like and what a movement could look like is a mature type of collectivism. That means that actually we are operating in solidarity and we're working collaboratively, and there is power sharing, and power sharing can only come with an acknowledgement of power. It can only come with an acknowledgement of actually, yes, within a context where we're talking about oppression operating more broadly, how do we attend to the different sites of intersecting oppressions and what that means for differently positioned groups of women. We're like rape crisis services, many of us are exhausted from fighting just for the crumbs, you know, in terms of services. Like it shouldn't be this way, but part of what we have failed to do is actually engage in genuine collaborative and collective advocacy and movement building. And because we haven't done that in terms of our sector more broadly, it means it's really easy to pick some of us off. And if you're going to start out with services that are going to be attacked first, it's always going to be the services led by the woman with a little bit more melanin, right? And that speaks to how structural inequality works and the hierarchies that we have here. And so some of what I'd like to see is I'd like that basic acknowledgement that, you know, we're not asking to be saved or rescued. We're just asking people to A, actually come in solidarity, and B, when we set up services, like leave us the hell alone, or like work with us, but for heaven's sake, don't come at us and try to shut down critical services, and don't expect us to perform more feminism in the way that you do, because actually we reserve the right to actually define our own feminist narratives, you know, and shape those between us and have those evolve, right? That for me is what sisterhood could look like, you know, and allowing the fierceness and the rage that surfaces within that, and seeing that rage as loving and seeing that rage as necessary.
Thank you. It's certainly giving me lots of food for thought. It's such an interesting topic, and it does feel like we could carry on that one question for a long time, but I know we wanted to give us an opportunity to sort of look to the future as well. So I'm going to move on to the next question, but definitely acknowledging that certainly as a rape crisis centre, as a feminist organisation, you know, we don't want this to be, this isn't the sum total of, you know, what we're going to do. We're going to be looking at the next year and beyond, and looking at what we can do, and really thinking about the power and influence we have and how we use it, because often we're so busy looking at the power and influence that we don't have, you know, against the state, as described earlier, against the patriarchy, you know, commissioners, funders, but actually we do have a lot of power and influence, and we're responsible, and we must be responsible for using that in a responsible way. So if I look on to the next question, so Survivors Network, we're 30 years old this week. Amazing. There's been ups and downs over the 30 years, but we're really hoping we're going to be here for another 30 years as well. So I'd like to know what the panelists think about feminist organising and survivor support and prevention work, and what would you hope would have been achieved by the movement 30 years from now? So that, say we're all here having this conversation in 30 years' time, you know, what we're hoping that we're going to be able to look back and have achieved together. I'd like to kick off.
I guess we could properly tag team on this one. There is this part of me which is probably just like always that kind of dreamer, you know. If I think about imagined futures, I don't want us to have to be here 30 years from now. I legit don't. I really want us all to have like created a world, you know, dismantled the white supremacist heteropatriarchy and the ableism and the capitalism that goes with that, in such a way that we are no longer needed, you know. If we do have to be here because somehow the power systems keep reshaping themselves, then I would want us to actually make all or intersectional framings a lot more meaningful. I would want us to to not be so hooked into the spectacle of violence as a way, you know, like I think about where we are right now and why conversations about racism and anti-Blackness and Black Lives Matter and those conversations and protests and resistance spaces feel so urgent in this moment, and how that's linked to the killing of one man, you know, so brutally on US soil. And, you know, and how that's linked to the pandemic that we are finding ourselves having to deal with. And I keep wondering why it took a policeman killing George Floyd for us to actually start to have particular conversations about race. You know, I keep saying this is the blackest Black History Month I've ever lived in my life in this country. Like you know, like the television choice is like absurd, right? And that, and some of that is linked to the fact that we draw too much on these moments of crisis and these moments, you know, of, like I said, violence in the spectacular in order to actually think about how we do this work. So for me, 30 years from now, I would have wanted us to have learned from this moment. I would want us to look back at 2020 with 2020 vision and go, you know, like actually, this was a moment that was painful, but also transformative. This was a moment that was distressing, but a moment that was also full of potency. I want us to use that potency and go, actually, when we look back, we're seeing services that were developed by and for. I want us to look at those services being sustainable. I want us to look at how we create movement spaces that connect environmental justice with rape crisis provision. I want us to think about how we care for individual women, how we support women to care for themselves, and how we care for the planet, how we actually recognize that it is not okay for us to disconnect from what we believe is happening in another space, how we think about militarization, how we think about economic justice, how we talk about trans rights, how we talk, like literally how we go. It's like Audre Lorde said, you know, I can't be free while any woman is unfree. I can't be free while any human being is unfree, right? And so how we lift ourselves to a place of meaning making and revolutionary labor that does something different, so we leave a different planet for generations to come, right? So that violence against women and girls is a distant memory rather than a thing that we know exists too much in the norm. That's what I would like us to be thinking about 30 years from now, if we have to.
So much of what you just said, I agree with all of it. And ideally, 30 years from now, I want to imagine a world without sexual violence. And if not, at least a world where our response to sexual violence is not reliance on the police state. Locking away the bad men without even having any kind of re-education programs is not the solution. We need to instead address the structures that create these bad men. And also, rapes are committed by people across the social order, but those prosecuted and incarcerated are often men from the marginalized communities. We have to always keep in mind that prisons reproduce and magnify the violence and the inequalities of the world outside, including sexual violence and institutionalized racism. And we can never have a fight against sexual violence if we support a criminal justice system that fosters this cycle of violence. Also, in most cases of rapes, the perpetrators are known to the survivors. A carceral system that criminalizes the perpetrator is not always what the survivor wants. And this is especially true in cases of, say, intimate partner violence or child sexual abuse. Priority is a safe shelter away from the family, and we have to prioritize these needs of the survivors. And this is what I have to say in terms of our response to sexual violence in 30 years. And in terms of, say, feminist movements, I mean, much of what Mariah said earlier, I hope for transnational solidarities for powerful survival-led movements that originate in the global south, and not just the other way around, which has been the norm so far. We need to move beyond this Euro-American centric understanding of even intersectionality, in fact. Like race, we need to have more transnational conversations on caste, which is a system of graded inequality in South Asian countries and amongst the diaspora. Dalit women, that is lower caste women, have faced systemic and structural violence. In fact, just this September, the brutal gang rape of a Dalit woman in Hathras village in India made international headlines. The institutionalized casteism of the state was on display when the police burned the body of the victim in the middle of the night to wipe out all evidence. And this particular instance led to remobilization of the Dalit Lives Matter campaign, but somehow it found so little resonance in global feminist movements. Why is it that when movements originate in the global north, for instance, the Me Too movement, it transforms into this transnational solidarities across the world? Why do movements from the global south not echo across the world when these movements are much more radical because they emerge from the grassroots? And this is why I think we need to reconstitute our very worldview of what intersectionality is.
Thank you. A lot of nodding going on from the panelists.
I think they've both answered it perfectly for me. So I don't know what else I could add to such amazing responses, really, apart from maybe just saying, I absolutely agree what they've both said, and, feel very passionate about more solidarity with the global south, as opposed to it always being seen as a place that we go in and save women from, but where there's, knowledge, expertise, things that we really, really need to learn, because what we do know is what is working. What we're doing here isn't working. It's not working. And we produce report after report after report, which tells us exactly the same thing. So we really have to reshift the focus. Something that worries me is around the rigid way in which sometimes violence against women and girls provision is structured. We're heading into, a really awful socio-economic crisis. So we've got to envision provision that looks at, like we were saying, whether it's linking with environmental justice, economic justice, and I don't feel that organizations are, they're kind of heading into this crisis and not really thinking about what they need to be doing internally around the support pathways that women are offered for generations to come, because we are in a deep recession and we're heading into a really bigger one globally. And what does that mean, in terms of violence, in terms of how we respond, so it isn't reactive. So we need to broaden how we look at violence against women and girls. And absolutely, we need to have more accountability from the state around those different systems. What is that accountability? What does that look like? I don't know the answer to that now, but if we don't have that, it makes a nonsense of, a criminal justice system, I think. We've been fighting for the right to exist, MCAN, by and for services, probably since I was, my life's work has been birthed in MCAN, and there, it's been exactly the same narrative in 30 years' time. I just don't want to have to justify our existence and why we're needed. Of course, I hope that we're not, we're living in a world without as much violence as we have. But if we're not, I hope that we're not constantly fighting for what I see as basic fundamental rights, to exist as Black minoritized women.
Thank you. And back to the other panelists, if you'd like to have anything you'd like to pick up on that the other speakers have said or expand on.
This is just such an amazing kind of circle energetically for me, just kind of the different things that are being kind of reflected and that we're saying. I really, this thing of what I call it the geopolitical north, because I'm fascinated by how it ended up being the global north and the global south. So I've just started disrupting that as well, because I'm like, India is in India's north, right? Like, and somehow, right, and then Australia is south, but it's somehow like global north. Yeah. Anyway, so I'm untidying all of it. Like that also is a thing for me around how 30 years from now, I want us to keep troubling all the things that we are being taught, that we've been taught through this kind of Eurocentric Enlightenment, colonial, international development kind of neoliberal capitalist framing, right? Like, which is always, it's always Europe and America, well, specifically the US, as in white America centering itself, right? There's something that happened for me with that Me Too moment, which is a really, if I think about 30 years from now, and I think about one of the things that we do need to learn, it's picking up on what Shalini said around, you have all of this movement and all of this activism happening in these different spaces that we can't pay attention to, that we're not willing to learn from, that we don't amplify, that we don't take seriously. So I think about, for example, the hashtag Life in Leggings in the Caribbean, which was running before like the Me Too hashtag. And I think about the fact that even with when Alyssa Milano dropped that tweet, right? And the fact that actually what had happened was that was Tarana Burke's work from 2006. And what it needed in that moment was clearly a white woman in Hollywood, rightfully speaking to her experience. But what it needed clearly was for Hollywood to make this real. And then it became something, right? And so there is also something about the cultural might of the US and the cultural might, and even in relation to these islands, right? Because we also don't listen to each other sometimes here. And so there's something for me about us also being able to look back at that moment and say, like Charlene said, like, what's happening there? Why is it that we aren't having, why is it that we're not working from the spaces in the geopolitical South? Why is it that we're not centering those spaces and that knowledge production, that expertise, that wisdom? Why is it that we're not bringing our whole selves to support those movements? Why is it that we aren't actually copying those hashtags? Why is it that we aren't saying, actually, this is what happened in India, or this is what happened in Jamaica, and this is what I'm going to march for today? So I'm going to show up because actually that woman was killed in India, and I'm going to turn out on the streets because Tambourine Army took themselves to the streets in Jamaica. I'm going to do that. There is something about us also, and this speaks to even those of us in the diaspora, right, about our relationship to our countries of origin, and the fact that we are also now in this situation where we exist in the geopolitical north and act in accordance with that, even though we're so deeply connected to our ancestral roots, right, or not. And so I also want us to actually change that. 30 years from now, I don't want to be having that conversation. I want it to be that the knowledge and the wisdom that is being centered all the time is that, right? And some of that is indigenous practice around justice systems, like at a very basic level, that has nothing to do with the carceral state, right? And for me, if we don't close prisons, if we don't, like, it's like all of that, this criminal justice system, let's think about it. Like, for me, as somebody who's descended from people that were enslaved, what hell of an investment could I have in people being just like locked up? Like, what? Like, why would I be interested in mimicking those structures? And I know that it's hard for us to imagine ourselves without the prison state. But actually, if we don't have the if my people didn't have the imagination, we wouldn't have had abolition, right? So I want us to actually be brave, I guess, is part of what I'd like us to have 30 years from now.
Yeah, be brave. That's a great It's a great statement. Would any of the other panelists like to come in and add to what's been said?
Yeah, I mean, the kind of world we're all thinking about, we're envisioning in the future, I only hope that this pandemic somehow accelerates our movement towards that world, because all the inequalities of the world have only been exacerbated by this pandemic. It's out there in the open for everyone to see. The failings of a neoliberal state, how these structures affect us on a daily basis, how it creates an unequal world. So I can only hope that we can step back and learn certain lessons and move towards a world that we are all thinking that where sexual violence or all these structures are no longer a reality.
Thank you. Shamanta, did you have anything to add? I mean, we could go on. I feel like there's so many different directions it could go off, and it's difficult not to sort of, obviously we're going to be coming to a close in a couple of minutes, but I just wanted to give people the opportunities to say last things.
I think it's that. I think it's what the others have said. It's about being brave. It's about embracing resistance. It's about not being fearful, even though everything the state tells us is about perpetrating fear and worry and fear of stepping outside of what might be considered the norm. And I think, I really hope for a stronger movement and a mobilization, and everyone is experiencing, like you were saying, some level of inequality. It's so much more exacerbated across communities that have felt quite secure and comfortable as well, are now subject to economic issues and problems that they probably had not thought about. So even some of the discussions I'm having with people, even in my own lives, they're different discussions. They're thinking about the world in a different way. They're thinking about what kind of legacy they want to leave for their children, and they have genuine concerns about basic rights to education, to employment, to everything. So I think we can't afford to sort of sit here, and we must be, brave, honest, open, and and kind, kind to each other, in a non, not in a performative way, but it's going to be really important. It is important.
It's definitely important. Thank you. And I was just sort of, from what you're saying, I was thinking, be brave, be kind, and be authentic as well. Like, I'm so grateful to your generosity, and I feel very privileged to have had this conversation with you as well. So thank you so much for joining Survivors Network in this panel event, and being so generous with your thoughts and your time in creating conversations that happened obviously in the build up to the event as well, and for coming here. And certainly there's a lot of things going through my head, and I feel like we could continue these discussions in the future in many different ways. And also we urge the people watching to look at their spheres of power and influence, their authenticity, how brave they want to be, how they feel we want to be taking these discussions into our own homes, into our own workplaces, and into the violence against women and girls sector, and wider within society. So I just wanted to end by saying thank you so much, Mara Larasai, Shalini Nair, and Shamata Roy. Thank you so much for joining us, and let's keep in touch, and let's continue these conversations. I'll commit now that I'm going to take this conversation forward and really see how Survivors Network can grow and develop. Hopefully we won't be around in 30 years' time, because there won't be any need, but we're definitely needed now, and this is what we need to be doing now. Thank you so much. Thank you all.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.